Story 1. The decision that saved their lives. It happened one Halloween, a night that naturally invited eerie tales and unsettling whispers. My friends and I had gathered in a cozy, dimly lit room, sharing ghost stories to match the season's spooky vibe. The atmosphere was electric, charged with excitement and the thrill of fear. One friend in particular seemed hesitant to share. She fidgeted with the hem of her sweater, her expression serious enough to immediately capture our attention. "I'm not sure I should tell this one," he began quietly, her voice tinged with reluctance. "It's not just some made-up story. This actually happened to my parents." The room fell silent, the weight of her words wrapping around us like a shroud. After some urging, she finally took a deep breath and started. "My parents' first date was unforgettable," she said with a small, nervous laugh. "It started out pretty typical, a diner in town, dinner, a few awkward exchanges. There was no real chemistry. They both kind of knew it wasn't going anywhere after that night. It was just one of those dates that felt like it was meant to end right then and there." She paused, gauging our reactions, then continued, her voice soft but intense. "But then, right at the end of the night, my dad decided to take a chance. He figured, what's the worst that could happen? He already knew there was no spark. So, as they were about to call it quits, he looked at her and said, 'How about we do something unexpected? Want to do something crazy with me right now?' My mother was taken aback and sure of what he meant. "Okay, what's this all about?" she asked, and he told her that he often took late night walks in Provo Canyon, a beautiful spot just outside town. There was a trail that led to an overlook where the stars were crystal clear, and it was far enough out that no one else ever came around. It sounded strange, but exciting, and suddenly, this date that was going nowhere had the potential to turn into something a bit more thrilling. So, they hopped in his car and drove to the canyon. It was a short trip, and soon, they were at the parking lot with nobody else in sight. Laughing and holding hands, they walked down a paved trail, the cool air thick with the night silence. But as they ventured deeper into the forest, something changed. The vibe shifted. At first, the night was fun, a little daring, but then, as they walked hand in hand, they both started to feel an intense dread creeping over them. Though neither of them spoke about it, it was as if something was lurking just beyond the trees. Neither of them knew how to explain it. They hadn't yet built that level of comfort in their relationship to share unspoken fears. They picked up their pace, silently agreeing to press forward. The rustling in the bushes beside them made their hearts race, but it wasn't until the guy stepped on something soft that they both froze. He couldn't tell what it was, some kind of animal, or maybe just the forest floor playing tricks on him. Whatever it was, it felt wrong, and they both felt it, though neither said a word. Without even looking, they turned and rushed back to the car. Once they were safely inside, the tension slowly melted away. They laughed about the strange feeling, wondering if it had just been a big animal, or maybe just nerves. But neither of them would ever forget how they had felt that night, how the forest seemed to close in around them. A few years later, they'd get married, and that night became an odd sort of bonding experience. A shared moment of fear they could look back on with something resembling affection. Then, one evening, about 10 years later, as they sat on the couch watching TV, a true crime documentary came on. Neither of them paid much attention at first, until an interview with the death row inmate caught their attention. The infamous serial killer, nearing his execution, was being asked about his past crimes, and during the interview, the journalist asked, "Was there ever a time you almost got caught?" The inmate smirked and nodded. "Yeah," he said, his voice chilling. "There was a time I was out in Provo Canyon, after I had just killed a girl. I was dragging her body across the trail when a couple came walking by. They stepped right over her, didn't even look down. They just kept walking, like they had no idea. I was standing there, just a foot away, waiting to see what they would do, but they didn't even stop. They turned and left. That was the one time I almost got caught." My friend's dad froze. His mind raced back to that night in Provo Canyon. The rustling in the trees, the soft thing he had stepped on, the dread that had overwhelmed them both. He looked at his wife, and the realization hit them like a bolt of lightning. That couple, the one who had unknowingly walked over the body, was them. It turned out, They had come into contact with one of the most notorious serial killers of all time, Ted Bundy. Had they stopped to investigate or even look down, the outcome would have been far different. My friend's parents would have been his next victims. Now, when my friend tells this story, she always ends with the same thought her father shared. I don't know what made us leave, but thank God we did.
Story 2. The Man in the Fog. My wife, Sarah, and I were on a fishing trip off the coast of Maine, a quiet stretch of water far from the bustling harbors. It was late at night, and the sea was calm, with a thin mist rolling in from the horizon. We had been out there all day, enjoying the peaceful solitude of the open water. The stars above were brilliant, and the air smelled fresh and clean. But the serenity was soon interrupted. A faint sound broke through the silence, an engine, low and steady, coming from the direction of the fog. We squinted into the darkness and saw an old motorboat approaching us. It was barely visible, drifting like a shadow, and there were no lights to signal its presence. It was as if the boat had been lost in time, weathered and wore. The man at the helm was an odd sight. He had a ragged beard, tattered clothes, and a gaze that was unnervingly intense. He pulled alongside our boat and, without introducing himself or offering a greeting, asked if we had any spare gasoline. His voice was gravelly, and his words seemed to carry an eerie sense of urgency. I thought about offering him some, but something about the way he spoke, and the way he stared at us, without blinking, made me hesitate. We told him that we had no spare gasoline, which was true. He didn't seem bothered by the refusal. Instead, he just stared at us, his eyes piercing the darkness. The silence between us was thick, and we both felt a growing unease. The man didn't seem in any hurry to leave, so after a few more awkward moments, he revved his engine and slowly drifted away into the fog, vanishing into the night as quietly as he had appeared. We tried to push the strange encounter out of our minds. The night went on, and we finished up to fishing for the day, ready to turn in. But as we lay in our cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I drifted off into a restless sleep, my mind replaying the strange man's face and his unsettling presence. It was sometime in the middle of the night when I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding. There, at the foot of our bed, was the man. His form was dark, barely visible in the low light streaming through the porthole. He stood there, unmoving, watching us. His eyes were hollow, almost as if they were not alive, but staring through us. My blood ran cold, and I couldn't breathe for a moment. My mind raced, but I was frozen in place. I tried to speak, to ask him what he was doing here, but the words wouldn't come. The silence between us was suffocating. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps soft but deliberate. I heard the faint sound of his footsteps fading as he moved down the hallway toward the deck. Moments later, I heard the engine of the motorboat start up again. It roared to life in the distance, growing fainter as the boat sped off into the night. My pulse slowed, but the unease lingered. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, unsure if what had happened was real or a nightmare. The whole situation felt like a terrible dream, one I couldn't wake from.
In the morning, we packed up and sailed back to shore, our thoughts heavy with what had occurred. Sarah was quiet, and I could tell she was feeling the same sense of dread. We reported the strange encounter to the Coast Guard, but they found no trace of the man or his boat. The authorities were dismissive, chalking it up to a misunderstanding or a local fisherman lost in the fog. But we knew what we had seen, and we knew something was wrong.
To this day, we still don't understand who that man was or what he wanted. His face, his eyes, and his strange behavior have haunted us ever since. We've heard no further reports of similar encounters in the area, but we've never gone back to that part of the coast. The memory of that strange man, staring at us from the edge of our bed, lingers like a shadow in the corners of our minds, unanswered and unsettling.
Story 3. The night someone came to my tent. When I was 19, my cousin, Olivia, and I decided to go camping in a remote valley known as Willow's Hollow, far away from any developed campgrounds. We wanted to escape the noise of the city, and this secluded spot seemed perfect, a place where we could relax, unwind, and enjoy the quiet beauty of nature. The sun was beginning to set as we arrived at our campsite. We pitched our tents beside a fast-flowing creek that wound its way through the valley. The landscape was breathtaking, with towering pines and the occasional burst of wildflowers dotting the forest floor. By the time darkness fell, we had a small fire going, and the two of us sat on logs, roasting marshmallows and swapping stories. After a while, we grew tired and decided it was time to head to bed. Olivia and I settled into our tents, positioned just a few feet apart. The night air was chilly, and the sound of the creek babbling nearby made it hard to fall asleep at first. But eventually, I started to drift off. Then, just past midnight, I heard it, a sound so faint at first that I thought it was just a trick of the wind, a soft rustling, followed by the unmistakable sound of a tent zipper. I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just Olivia adjusting something inside her tent. But then I heard it again, a clear and deliberate motion, as if someone was opening the flap of a tent, and it wasn't hers. I froze, my heart racing in my chest. The sound came from just outside my tent, so close I could almost feel the presence of another person. My first instinct was to check if Olivia was still inside her tent, but when I glanced toward hers, the shadows under the fabric were still. She was asleep, completely unaware of the disturbance. The sound continued, the zipper of my own tent now slowly being pulled open, as if someone was trying to get a better look inside. I held my breath, my eyes wide, unable to make a sound. Who was out there? Why were they opening our tents? I slowly unzipped my tent, just a little, and peeked out. There, near the edge of the trees, I saw the vague outline of a figure. It was hard to make out details in the darkness, but the shape was tall, standing perfectly still, as if waiting for something. The figure seemed to be peering into my tent, its head turned slightly to the side, as though it was trying to see inside without making a noise. My body went cold with fear. I wanted to call out, to shout, but my throat was dry, and no words would come. I quickly zipped my tent back up, my pulse pounding in my ears. The figure didn't move, just stayed there in the shadows. The silence that followed was deafening. I lay still, barely daring to breathe, afraid that if I made a sound, the stranger would know I was awake and nearby. I don't know how much time passed. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and I couldn't sleep, my mind racing with possibilities. Who could it have been? There was no other campsite nearby, no other vehicles parked along the road. We were alone in the valley. Eventually, I heard the sound of footsteps retreating, crunching through the underbrush. The figure was gone, but I still didn't move. I lay in the darkness, staring at the fabric of my tent, too scared to sleep. The morning sun finally broke through the trees, and the world outside felt different, still and calm, but with an undeniable sense of unease. I woke Olivia, telling her about the strange events of the night. At first, she didn't believe me, brushing it off as some wild imagination or a figment of my dreams. But when we checked around the campsite, we found nothing out of place. No signs of anyone passing through, no tracks, nothing that could explain the presence I had felt. We packed up quickly, eager to leave the valley behind. I don't know what happened that night, and I still don't have any answers. All I know is that someone I never saw was out there, just beyond my tent, watching us. To this day, I avoid camping alone, and I can never quite shake the feeling that there's something else in those dark woods, something waiting in the shadows.